In our last episode, we talked about the canonization, and we talked about patterns as a way of thinking about poetry. But this has been part of our meditation on poetry throughout. We've talked about not only what a poem says, but also its formal patterns like rhyme schemes, meters, the use of commonplaces or topoi, or those imagery that are shared across poems. We've also noted how poems change in style. Now, George Herbert was a clergyman, he was a Protestant clergyman, who wrote religious poetry. And he's famous for his pattern poetry, or emblem poetry, or shaped poetry, or as it's called today, concrete poetry. All four of those terms, they change through time. We keep getting new terms to describe this kind of poetry. But let's just use concrete poetry for now. Concrete poetry has a venerable history dating back to the Greeks and Romans. Like the prosometrum, which mixes verse and prose, it too is a hybrid form. In this case, the visual and the linguistic. It combines pictures with the literary. But it's not ekphrasis, remember. Ekphrasis is a figure that describes a picture through words. And we've seen ekphrasis, for example, in Beowulf in describing the engravings on a sword. Hrothgar spoke, he examined the hilt, that relic of old times. It was engraved all over and showed how war first came into the world and the flood destroyed the tribe of giants. They suffered a terrible severance from the Lord. The Almighty made the waters rise. These are all images found on the hilt of the sword. Ekphrasis' venerable history in its own right, stretching back to the Iliad in the description of a shield, to Allen of Lille in the description of nature's gown. But concrete poetry is different. Here, language is conceived as visual, not describing the visual. In other words, concrete poetry or pattern poetry or shaped poetry or emblem poetry, there's so many names for this literary phenomena, is a poem that is given a shape not only to read but to look at. That's the key. This style is alive even today. Look at this incredible poem. Or look at this one from my friend Mark Yakich, who is a great poet right now. Pause and you can read it. And of course, don't forget Alice in Wonderland. Let's look at George Herbert's The Altar. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, made of a heart and cemented with tears, whose parts are as thy hand did frame. No workman's tool hath touched the same. A heart's alone is such a stone as nothing but thy power doth cut. Wherefore each part of my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name, that if I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not seize. O let thy blessed sacrifice be mine, and sanctify this altar to be thine. In George Puttenham's Art of English Poesy, a Ars Poetica or how-to manual on how to write a poem in the 16th century, we know that Shakespeare read this book. He describes this image as a display. Now, a poem always has some sort of proportion. And for Puttenham, this usually has to do with meter and lines and stuff like that. But there is the possibility of proportions in figure. Your last proportion is that of figure. Talking about proportion figure. So called, for it yields an ocular representation, a picture to your eyes, not in the mind. Your meters, that's the line lengths that you choose, being by good symmetry reduced into certain geometrical figures. Representation is the key term because representation is a key theoretical concept during this period. It's related to Aristotle and mimesis. Words represent things and the world. But here, the words are shaped to be the thing that they are representing. And the constraint is obvious. The poem must make an image. Your meters, being by good symmetry reduced into certain geometrical figures, whereby the maker is restrained to keep him within his bounds, and showeth not only more art, but serveth also much better for briefness and subtlety of device. But isn't that for all poets, that criteria? A certain brevity and subtlety in writing the poem? Puttenham's displayed poems, as he calls them, are usually triangles or eggs, and the eggs are the displayed. And sometimes they will have their inverted shapes, and he calls those inverted shapes reversals. These are the shapes. You get the lozenge or rhombus, you get triangles, you get squares, you get cylinders, you get the rondel or sphere, but you also get these displayed ones like the triquet over here, or the rondel displayed over here, or the egg and then the egg displayed. We see the display and reversal pattern as well in George Herbert's The Altar. But here it is a column. That's the Roman pillar design. And you can see visually how it follows Puttenham's description. The pillar is a figure among all the rest of the geometrical, most beautiful in respect that he is tall and upright and of one bigness from the bottom to the top. In architecture, he is considered with two accessory parts, a pedestal or base and a chapter or head. The body is the shaft. That's a geometrical shape. But this figure is signified stay, support, rest, state, and magnificence. That's what it means. Your ditty or poem, then, being reduced into the form of a pillar, his base will require to bear the breadth of a meter of 6 or 7 or 8 syllables, the shaft of 4, the chapter equal with the base. Let's look at George Herbert's Altar and see if those details fit. It's a Doric column, and just like the way Puttenham describes it, it has right here a chapter or head. This, of course, is the shaft. These are lines 5 to 12. 1 to 4 are the chapter or head. 5 to 12 are the shaft. And then lines 13 to 16, that's the pedestal or base. As for the meters, as Puttenham calls it, he mentioned syllables. Notice that the chapter, and this will also be the case with the pedestal or base, is tapered. And this is part of the design of the Doric column anyway, if you look at parts of a Doric column. And the top part of the chapter, before it tapers down, is iambic pentameter. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears. The same with the second line. When the chapter or head tapers down, it becomes iambic tetrameter, whose parts are as thy hand did frame. Notice iambic tetrameter, 4 feet, and this, of course, is promotion because of the iambic rhythm. And finally, the shaft is iambic dimeter, a heart alone. An iambic dimeter means 2 feet is such a stone. So in other words, in terms of his setup, 10 syllables, 10 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 4 syllables, 4 syllables. Now notice also the typography. There are greater separations to make sure that there is flushing to the right and to the left, so that the design is not only perfect here on the left, flush right, but perfect on the left, dittos here and here. What about the famous Easter wings? Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor, with thee, oh, let me rise as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories, then shall the fall further the flight in me. My tender age in sorrow did begin, and still with sickness and shame thou didst so punish sin that I became most thin. With thee let me combine and feel thy victory, for if I imp my wings on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. Did you notice how the poem works through its meters? The poem narrows from iambic pentameter to iambic tetrameter, 4 feet or 8 syllables, to iambic trimeter, 3 feet or 6 syllables, to iambic dimeter, 2 feet or 4 syllables, and then finally to iambic monometer, 1 foot or 2 syllables, as man decays and becomes poor or sickens with sin. And then with thee, that's the refrain that runs through both wings. He rises in a flight of victory. With thee, iambic, that's iambic monometer, because it is 1 foot or 2 syllables. Remember, this is still, there are still syllabic counts at this period. We are not in Romanticism where a foot can be trisyllabic. Oh, let me rise. I'm convinced that is trochaic inversion, but if you don't, you can say, oh, let me rise, and that would be perfectly fine iambic. As larks harmoniously, and this, as larks, of course there's caesura here, as larks harmoniously, this neously, this neous, this is that slurring. Well, we can call it slurring, but in fact it is synerasis, where 2 syllables turn into 1. So harmoniously, which is 5 syllables, becomes harmoniously 4 syllables. And this, of course, is also iambic trimeter. And sing this day, there's the caesura, that metrical pause on the line, and sing this day thy victories, that is iambic tetrameter, because there are 4 feet, right? Then for the final line, as we separate from sin in the fall, then shall the fall, caesura, then shall the fall further the flight in me. And notice we have right here trochaic inversion after the caesura. Perfectly fine, because all of the metrical variants are always on the left side, either at the beginning of the line or right after a caesura. Now, unfortunately, that's not the way the poem is supposed to be displayed. This is the way Easter Wings was published in 1633. You're supposed to be able to put these wings on and rise above sins and its consequences, death. And for the next episode, let's look at the 18th century.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.